Kingdom of Men, Chapter 3, Belarone Castle. I can't stay here, KaLeah thought, as she was shown into her room. The room was as large as her entire house back in Arion, the bed itself bigger than her bedroom. The floors were a beautiful dark wood with thick, richly colored rugs spread about. There were two large chairs with wooden carved arms facing a fireplace across from the bed. The bed had four posts on each of the corners that almost reached up to the ceiling. The bedposts, along with most of the wood furniture in the room, had depictions of dragons intricately carved throughout. The fabrics and pillows on the bed looked as if they had come from a dream. Gold, crimson red, and stark white covered every inch of the room. She unlatched her belt and removed the quiver of arrows from her shoulder. She sat all her weapons on the bench at the foot of the bed, then took off her boots. She ran her fingers across the blanket on the bed and slowly crawled onto it. The massive bed was more comfortable than anything she'd ever slept on. Well, maybe I could stay a night or two, she reconsidered. Her eyes closed, and all her senses were acutely aware of the way the bed melted around her body, how she sank down in slow motion, how the silks and furs tickled and soothed her hands and arms as she spread herself across the bed. She slipped into a light nap before realizing it. "Nice, isn't it?" Amira asked, giggling. "Much better than a bed of tree needles and leaves." KaLeah bolted upright on the bed, embarrassed to be caught so enamored with bed linens. "Princess," KaLeah said, etching herself off the bed. "Don't worry," said Princess Amira. She moved closer and jumped up onto the bed, her skirts spreading out around her. She had changed from her riding gear and now wore an empire-waisted, light green dress with white piping. Her hair had been brushed free of dirt and leaves and pinned back along the sides, and shimmery blonde ringlets fell down her back. The princess smelled as if she'd bathed in rose oils. KaLeah admired the dress, never having seen anything so beautiful, and yet she had a feeling this was probably nothing compared to other dresses the little princess probably owned. "I'm glad you like the bed. You're going to have a lot of fun here. We'll go riding together. Maybe you can teach me how to hunt. Father doesn't like it when I act, well, unlike a princess should." Amira rolled her eyes. "But I really like to learn new things, whether or not they are things a princess should learn. It isn't fair my brothers can do things I am not allowed to do. Will you teach me how to hunt and fight with a sword?" Her eyes, which seemed to be greener now that she was wearing a green dress, sparkled up at KaLeah. Teaching someone to hunt and fight could take months. She knew she couldn't refuse the king, but she needed to make it clear to Amira she wasn't planning on staying long. "Princess Amira," KaLeah said, "I must keep searching for my father. I cannot stay here. I can teach you a few skills in a few days, but after that, I must leave. My father could be out there in the market center right now." Amira lowered her eyes in a pout. "I understand. At least you will be here for my birthday celebration. You will be an honored guest, a hero. I don't think—" The child princess immediately puffed up. "You must and you will, KaLeah. Let us go meet with Valere and Dory. They're going to help me choose dresses for you." Amira jumped down from the bed and headed for the bedroom door. "Why do I need dresses?" KaLeah looked down at her traveling clothes. They were covered in dirt stains and splatters of blood. Her boots were so stiff with mud, she wasn't sure if she could even get them back on without a thorough scrubbing. "Leave those things. The maids will clean them for you. For now, we will get you cleaned up and then transform you into someone fancy." The little girl looked as mischievous as she was excited, as if KaLeah were some sort of life-sized doll. KaLeah left her weapons and boots in the room and followed Amira through corridors that seemed to become more and more lavish. Large tapestries hung on the walls, illustrating the creation stories of Naldash. She had heard the legends, but had never seen them illustrated. The tapestries told the story of two dragon species, one of land and one of air, that feuded for hundreds of years. A dragon was born from a forbidden union of both species, the first and only mixed species dragon. Men named the mixed species dragon of their legends KaLeah. It is said that when his mother was killed by her tribe as punishment, he became so angry he let out a stream of magic so powerful it sent his mother's entire tribe to the barren planet Denlarak. All the dragons eventually died off, and other animals, including humans, began to evolve on Naldash. According to the stories, Denlarak became known as the Dead Planet. It hangs in the sky above Naldash as a dark and desolate orb. It is said that KaLeah continues to send the souls of the dead to Denlarak. KaLeah paused in front of a tapestry depicting the immortal dragon. He stood on two legs with his silvery wings spread out behind him. His scales were dark green and his eyes menacing. He didn't resemble the phantom dragon she'd seen in the woods, but for a moment she wondered if maybe the legends were true. Had she seen the immortal dragon? Princess Amira cleared her throat impatiently at the end of the hall, snapping KaLeah out of her trance. She followed the princess into a massive dressing room where two women were waiting with selections already dangling from their arms. The room was a giant closet. Every wall had shelves stacked with boxes and hundreds of shoes arranged by color and size. There were racks draped with rows and rows of dresses, silks, linens, and scarves. Hats lined the top rows of every shelf. Dresses hung from rods that connected one set of shelves to another. A tall panel of 3 mirrors stood off to one side, near a row of windows. And in the center of the room was a round, velvet blue, tufted ottoman, the size of the bed back in her guest quarters. The room was a paradise of silk and cotton, robes and gowns. There were tables strewn about with various jewels, necklaces, bracelets, and other glittery items laid out neatly or hanging from small hangers in the shapes of trees, horns, and dragon talons. KaLeah, these are my nurses, Dory and Falair. They've taken care of me since I was a baby. The princess led KaLeah to where the lady nurses were standing to view their selection. She nodded, and the ladies carried the clothing over to the large, round ottoman. Dory, the oldest nurse, was plump with short gray hair that seemed to perfectly match the long gray dress she wore. Her face was wrinkled around her eyes and mouth as if she had spent many years worrying. After laying her selections on the ottoman, she returned to searching the racks for more dresses. The other nurse, Falair, was much younger and very pretty. Her nose was sharply pointed, and somehow, even though she also wore an ugly gray dress, hers seemed to hang in a way that flattered every curve of her body. Falair had manicured eyebrows, and strawberry blonde hair hung in a loose braid over her right shoulder. She was picking through accessories and ignored KaLeah entirely. Falair lifted a diamond and ruby necklace. "Dear Princess," Falair said, "nothing catches the eyes of strangers quite like red. This piece would look very mature with a red dress." Amira looked over at the necklace Falair was holding and then shrugged. She went back to searching the racks. Dory shot Falair a nasty glance and then said, "Pink is much better for 10-year-olds. Honestly, Falair, can't you find something more appropriate for her age?" Falair huffed and set the piece down, reluctantly moving toward the jewels that were lighter in weight and color. KaLeah managed to slowly back away from the women and lean against the door to the room, watching the women fluttering around the racks and shelves. She shuddered uncomfortably. She was accustomed to dark pants and green or brown shirts. The ladies of Arion wore dresses, but their dresses more closely resembled the long gray dresses worn by the nurses. KaLeah had never desired to wear anything other than pants her entire life. "Found it!" Dory cried from behind a row of racks. She scurried around to face the other ladies. In her hands, she held out a dress for all the women to see. Amira began clapping and laughing. The dress was long and dark pink. The shoulders were tiny straps that came down to meet a high empire waist. From the top of the dress, there was a sheer, lighter pink fabric that hung down over the darker pink. "It is perfect!" Amira exclaimed. The ladies proceeded to dress Amira in her birthday gown. But what will your rescuer wear, Princess Amira? Falair asked, mischievously raising one eyebrow. Amira whispered something to Falair. The tall, thin woman smiled wide and then laughed as both girls turned their gazes toward KaLeah. You will wear a red one, Amira said. KaLeah's stomach nodded. Falair came out from behind a rack holding a very mature-looking red dress. It had a slit on its right side that extended from mid-thigh to the ground, and it was lined with diamonds. KaLeah gulped. I will not wear that, she said with shock. Then, feeling a bit disrespectful, she changed her tone to one of modesty. It is much too expensive and glamorous for me, Princess, KaLeah said, bowing slightly for good measure. Before she knew it, there were 4 hands peeling her dirty clothes away from her. KaLeah felt as if her very skin were being removed. And then she was in a dark red cave as the ladies pulled the dress over her head. When it was all over, KaLeah was escorted to a mirror. You look beautiful, Amira said, gleefully clapping her hands together again. And I don't know why you bowed earlier when we saw my father, but you cannot bow in this dress. Ladies curtsy. You are a lady in that dress. She lifted the corner of her lip, not bothering to ask what a curtsy was. It sounded ladylike, and she wasn't interested. KaLeah brushed oily dark strands of hair away from her face and looked at herself in the mirror. She no longer looked 16. She looked as mature as any of the women in her village. It was laughable, silly, and yet she couldn't quite help but feel a little different. She was still dirty, a hunter, and a farmer, but standing there with a princess wearing a dress that was worth more than her house, maybe more than her whole village. She wondered if she could be more than just a hunter and farmer from Arion. What would her father think? He had always been fine with her dressing like a boy, but would he be upset seeing me in a dress? Princess Amira came up to stand beside her in front of the mirror. A curtsy is like this, she said. Amira took up 2 edges of her skirt, pushed one foot back behind the other, then lowered her head and torso. KaLeah scrunched her face up. She was right. It was very ladylike, like the dress, but she didn't want to hurt the little girl's feelings. She pinched the silky red fabric between her fingers, pulled it up slightly, then bowed down without tucking one foot behind the other. She felt ridiculous. The princess chuckled sweetly. We'll practice, she said. 2 days later, KaLeah was standing in the same dress in front of the same mirror. She had spent those 2 days eating, bathing, napping, and walking around the castle grounds with the young Princess Amira, telling her stories and giving history lessons on Belarone Kingdom and her family. KaLeah had admittedly taken more baths in the last 2 days than she had in a month back in Arion Village. Being in the castle was like being in a dream where all her worldly concerns melted away into nothing. She hoped that her father had started to head back to their village, and she told herself that she would start back there soon, after the party. Looking at herself now, pampered, powdered, and polished, and seeing how her long brown hair fell in waves across the dark red dress, she felt as if she were no longer KaLeah at all. At least, she was no longer the version she'd known all of her life. The red dress was sleeveless and tight, lifting her small breasts up. It hugged her slight curves, traveling down her body from breasts to ankles. The shimmery red was accentuated by a trail of diamonds lining the edges of the slit. The slit started mid-thigh and opened only slightly down the length of the dress where it finally pulled out at the floor. Falair had spent hours expertly curling and pinning her and Amira's hair and painted their faces with powders and lip stain. She stepped back to admire her work. Everyone at the party will think you're a noble. No one would believe from looking at you now that you are just a village farmer. KaLeah could hear the disdain and jealousy in Falair's voice, but she ignored it because her words were true. She did not look like herself at all. Are you ready, my friend? Amira bounced up and down excitedly behind the ladies. She Nicolot. Prince Nicolot hated parties at the castle. He would have to feign charm, meet and talk to people he had no interest in, and try to keep himself entertained by stumping strangers with dry wit and sarcasm. He made it a point to enter the ballroom late and slip in unnoticed. He entered through a side servant door, coming out behind a long table stacked high with various food and drink that did nothing to interest him. Servers were busily handing guests tiny cakes on saucers or teacups filled halfway with warm juices. They didn't notice him passing behind them or beyond the table, which rounded inward to complete an illusion of separation between the guests and servants. The long ballroom had been divided into sections, establishing areas for eating, lounging, mingling, and dancing. It was sometimes also called the throne room, depending upon how the room was being used at the time. Nicolot stayed close to the tapestried walls, trying to go unnoticed as he looked past the dance floor toward his father's table. His father sat on his throne, and the table had been placed horizontally so that his father, the king, was squarely in the middle of not only the table, but the centerpiece of the party as well. The room was loud with scattered conversations. Nicolot tried to focus on the sound his heels made against the shiny marble floor, a calming sound that was unfortunately lost before it reached his ears. Instead, he was submerged in the sounds of hubris, nobles bragging about their newest this or that, a child's accomplishments, successes, and other such menial things. It was the laughter that he found the most excruciating. He wondered why the people with the most terrible laughs always seemed to laugh the loudest. Candle chandeliers the size of small tables hung from the ceiling, and candelabras a head taller than Nicolot were strewn about the edges of the ballroom. The light from the flames made the figures in the tapestries appear to be dancing. Doing well, he thought. I've managed a few moments in here without anyone noticing me so far. He didn't feel particularly like smiling, shaking hands, or being praised for doing absolutely nothing all day long except preparing to be the backup king, in case by some miracle his older brother Bilex were to get trampled by a dragget. Nicolot clenched his fists and turned his glare to his older brother, sitting obediently at his father's side. Anger slowly rippled through him, as it always did when he looked upon the rightful heir. It was ludicrous. Not only was Bilex slower and simpler, but he hadn't excelled at his lessons, as Nicolot had, or bested all the kingdom's swordsmen, as Nicolot had. He lacked charm, and even lacked the good looks that Nicolot and Amira had been graced with. Sure, they were both olive-skinned, dark-haired, and blue-eyed, but Nicolot's features were more chiseled and refined. He also kept his form in top shape, where his brother had always been soft and weak. Nicolot turned his attention back to the ballroom. It was the largest room in the palace, and he thought it an amazing room despite the absurd decorations. Tonight, the ballroom was decorated with pink silk ribbons, pink roses, hydrangeas, and fragrant lilies. His father's royal rejects, wealthy and yet not quite lucky enough to be royalty, meandered about, dressed in their finest, newest clothing and jewelry. Nicolot knew that most of the young ladies in the room hoped that one day, as the daughters of wealthy men, they'd be married to a prince. They didn't care if that prince were to ever become a king. It was the prince part that really got them excited. The rich favor families were bred to marry royalty. He cringed at the sight of some of the women. Most tried to hide their age behind dark makeup, while the younger ones batted their eyes and flirted relentlessly. The men stood around, hoping the princes wouldn't notice the women they had already chosen for themselves. A smile spread across Nicolot's face, thinking about the satisfaction of stealing some other man's fantasy girl. What no one, except Nicolot and his father, knew was that he wouldn't be marrying one of the favor's daughters. The kingdom of Lysodania, to the southeast, was ruled by a king with too many daughters. In order to ensure peace between the two kingdoms, Nicolot would marry one of those daughters, regardless of looks or intelligence. Although a tiny part of him was enticed by the idea of moving out of the castle, he did not like the idea of being pleasant to a princess and her father until the father died. It was hard enough being pleasant in his own father's castle. He'd have to pretend a lover until that fateful day, which may not come for a very, very long time. Nicolot wanted to be king sooner than later. He continued to slink along the edges of the walls and let his mind drift back to his own 10th birthday ceremony. It had been exhilarating, walking out of the double doors and into the ballroom. He had caught his father's eyes first, and then cast his glance over 100 other smiling faces, all apparently happy to see him, and yet all as blank and empty as Bilex behind their pleasant expressions. He looked out now over the same smiling faces as they eagerly awaited his sister's arrival. He rolled his eyes to himself and grabbed a glass of wine from a nearby table. A cold chill gripped his spine and he shuddered. He turned, and sure enough, Favor Lamone was making his way over to him. He loved the man about as intensely as one loved the blade of a knife at one's throat. Lamone knew Nicolot's darkest secrets, which was unfortunate, since Lamone was the last man Nicolot would ever want to trust. However, there was no man better for plotting and scheming. "Good evening, my prince," Lamone said in a high-pitched, thickly nasal voice. Lamone, who was 19, a couple years older than Nicolot, was tall like him, but much thinner and paler in the face with a sharp nose and sunken eyes. "Lamone," Nicolot said. He glanced around to make it look as if he was snarling because of the party and not because of Lamone's arrival. "Why so down?" Lamone asked. "None of the women catch your eye yet? There's a tight butt on the far wall in a light blue dress. Wonder who helped her squeeze into that one." "For dragon's sake, don't you ever do anything besides gawk?" Nicolot said, nonchalantly turning an eye in the direction Lamone was looking. But then, after seeing the girl, he added, "Not bad." Just then, a few of the king's attendants clanged their silverware against their glasses. The talking and laughing instantly died down, and everyone turned to face the king. King Erezus had been sitting in his throne watching his guests. Now he stood. Nicolot's eyes took in the golden-trimmed throne. The arms were made of carved dragon heads, and the back was a great oval covered in brilliant red silk. Nick often dreamed of sitting on that throne. Everyone grew quiet and faced the king. "Loyal friends and favors, welcome to Belarone Castle," King Erezus bellowed. "Today is my daughter's 10th birthday. Amira Belarone came into this world on a day the sun didn't rise. We lost her mother, my beloved Queen Sorora, and for the first time in 100 years the sun was eclipsed by Denlerac. Both events cast our world into darkness. But from that darkness came my daughter, whose cheerful spirit seemed to bring back the light. We will no longer mourn on this day. From this moment on, this day is to be celebrated across the kingdom as Princess Amira's birthday. May I present my daughter, Princess Amira Belarone." All eyes moved with the king as he raised his hands toward the doors directly behind and to the left of the throne. The enormous double doors were etched with dragons, like most everything else in the castle. Not only had most of the animals on Naldash evolved from dragons, but dragon spirits were believed to linger and influence every aspect of daily life. It was in the best interest of humans to ensure their surroundings were adored with respectful depictions of the strength and beauty of those lingering spirits. Nick had grown up surrounded by them and the legend, but had found no influence in his life, at least not enough to put any faith in them. Royal rooms reserved for family and special guests laid beyond the doors. There were lounges with mirrors, water basins, chambers, and refreshments for last-minute needs. Nicolot reluctantly turned with everyone else to look upon the doors and tried to smile as if he hadn't seen his sister a million times. The doors were opened, slowly and theatrically, by two house guards. Amira stood on the threshold, wearing a classically pink princess dress, high-waisted and bowled out. Her smile was so wide that it seemed as if her face might split in two. She was wearing at least 5 different jeweled necklaces, and her tiny wrists were weighted down with bracelets. He knew she had picked them all out herself. No one would dare to tell her not to overdo her jewelry. Lamone let out a sudden gasp behind him. Dragon's blood, Lamone said. Nicolot was just about to tell Lamone that Amira was just a child when he saw her, a young woman in a red dress, walking through the doors behind Amira. Brown hair with hints of red rolled across her shoulders, and with every other step a long ivory leg peeked out from a delicate slit cut into the side of the dress. She was glowing without smiling, and it was that lack of a smile that really got to Nicolot. His heart started to pound harder as he moved his eyes down her body. She was wrapped from head to toe in a bright red dress that seemed to squeeze her in all the right places. That's no woman, he thought. The leg that he could see had the most defined calf muscle he'd ever seen on a woman. Her arm muscles were more rounded than most soldiers he knew. Her long neck went straight up to piercing eyes that seemed to scan everything. She was fierce. She was strong. That's a killer. Who is she? Lamone asked. One of the favors? No, I've never seen her before. It must be the girl rumored to have saved Amira from the kidnappers. She's supposed to be just some young village girl. She is definitely not as I pictured her. That girl saved the princess? What did she do? Sex the kidnappers to death? Maybe not such a bad way to go. Lamone chuckled at his own joke and stood so close to Nicolot that he could smell the meat on his breath. I've got to have her, Prince, Lamone said. With your permission, of course. Nicolot could feel his neck get hot. The first interesting new woman in a long while, and Lamone instantly tries to claim her. It irritated him to no end, but he bit his tongue. Nicolot couldn't take his eyes off the woman. Her hair fell in soft, curly waves that seemed to reflect the candlelight. At one moment it looked like burnt gold, and the next like crimson blood. Her eyes never seemed to leave Amira, but he knew she was scanning everyone in the room. He could sense her, feel her from across the expanse, and he was enticed. Princess Amira sat down, and the girl in the red dress stood directly behind her. She was beautiful. He tried to tear his thoughts away from her, and instead gritted his teeth. He did require more of Lamone's services, after all. Prince? Fine, he said to Lamone, who lightly clasped his wiry fingers together. She's all yours. He could have sworn the little rodent squealed. KaLeah. Thank you, friends, for the warm welcome, the king said. We have many reasons to celebrate today. Not only is it the celebration of the birth of my beloved daughter, but as many of you know, her life was recently in great danger. Men kidnapped her while she was riding. General Joseph Ray and his captains are still trying to uncover the reasons and the criminals responsible. We were lucky that the dragon spirits intervened and sent an accidental rescuer along her path. I would like to introduce and honor the woman who found and rescued her. Please welcome the Lady KaLeah from Arion. KaLeah's face flushed with heat, and she wished that the absurdly long table could be just as equally tall. She looked out over the elegant crowd as they clapped with gloved hands. Some women had tears in their eyes, and some of the men just looked stunned. Standing in her diamond-encrusted red dress, she did not look capable of defeating a cute little animal, let alone kidnappers in the woods that had eluded the king's soldiers for days. Of course, to most of the king's men, no woman looked capable of such a feat. To say it was out of the ordinary was an understatement. We are most grateful to the lady for returning our princess to us, the king continued. He took a couple steps to stand beside KaLeah, then lightly lifted and kissed the back of KaLeah's hand. She was surprised and found herself smiling up at him. He gave her a quick wink and turned to face the patrons, placing his hands on his daughter's shoulders. Amira beamed up at him. Thank you all for coming this evening to celebrate the long life of our royal daughter, Princess Amira. Please enjoy the birthday festivities. The king returned to his throne in the center of the table. Amira was seated to the king's right, with a chair beside her reserved for KaLeah. She felt more than a little out of place when Amira asked her to sit. Am I not a servant, Your Highness? Amira chuckled. You are a hero today, KaLeah. Please sit and eat beside me. One of the servants quickly pulled the chair out for KaLeah, who realized that sitting in a tight dress would be the first challenge she hadn't prepared for. Her legs seemed to dive out from the slit, and she felt embarrassingly exposed. She overcompensated by sliding into her chair too quickly. The bright smile never left Amira's rosy cheeks. The young girl patted KaLeah's arm reassuringly. You'll get used to all of this, she said. That's my brother, Prince Bilex, sitting on the other side of my father. KaLeah leaned forward a bit to see the handsome man to the left of the king. Prince Bilex was talking with his father with a drink in his hand, which seemed to be adorned with more jewels than KaLeah had ever seen on a man. He was of average build, not muscular, with black hair that hung slightly below his ears. The chair to the left of Bilex was empty. The long table stretched the width of the ballroom, but there were no other chairs. KaLeah had the impression that the honor of an extra presence at the table was not one that others enjoyed often. Swarms of servers were suddenly flitting about the table, lightly moving to stand near various food options laid out on the table, waiting for a royal to nod in approval of a selection. They would then quickly select a modest portion and move to the next option. The server responsible for KaLeah cleared her throat. She didn't even recognize most of the options as food. Everything was so pretty. Slabs of meat were surrounded with potatoes and other vegetables cut into decorative shapes. She made eye contact with her server and leaned toward her. The girl was about her size with dark hair cut short behind her ears. You choose, she whispered. KaLeah widened her eyes, trying to wordlessly communicate her need for someone with a little more experience to make the selection. The girl seemed to understand perfectly, and she gave a slight smile in response. She and the other servers moved in a dance around one another as they interpreted nods and made selections. When the girl returned with two full plates to present to KaLeah, she laid them down and whispered, A few of my favorites, miss. KaLeah was relieved and thanked the girl. She suddenly realized how hungry she was and began to eat. My brother, Prince Nicola, doesn't like these sorts of parties, Amira said. She had made her selection and was eating, using very delicate silverware. She nodded toward the crowd in the ballroom. He's out there in the crowd somewhere, I'm sure. You may meet him eventually. She rolled her eyes, insinuating that her brother was difficult to intercept. KaLeah took a bite of a richly colorful fruit salad and looked out across the crowd. She was startled to notice several eyes on her, quickly darting away to continue discussing her, she assumed. She was not used to people looking upon her curious and admiring. KaLeah, I dare say you've taken on quite a transformation, the king boomed from his place at the table. I'm guessing my daughter was responsible for the dress and hair? He laughed heartily. Never fear, her punishment shall be harsh and swift, and you will be restored to your comfortable self soon enough. Shall I call the guards? Amira's cheeks turned pink with embarrassment. Father, she said proudly, the ladies have done a marvelous job with KaLeah. I do not disagree, dearest, the king said. He smiled at them both and then left the table to mingle with his guests. Everyone who passed by the table to wish happy birthday to Amira couldn't help but let their eyes pass across her humble savior as well. KaLeah felt like a thick slice of woo-vat steak hanging over starving, salivating dragons. The men were especially gawky. She tried to ignore them and instead tried to admire the ballroom and the colorful spectacle of the decorations and dresses twirling about the room like paintbrushes. She suddenly felt as if she were being intensely watched and turned to see two young men staring at her from across the room. One of the men was very thin and pasty white. He looked as if he was ill or lost in a treacherous thought. He was giving her a grimacing smile, and a tingle crawled up her spine. The other was leaning against a wall and looking at her without any expression on his face. His hair was dark black, and he was lean but muscular. He was wearing a long, dark gray cape connected to a sleeveless black vest that buttoned from his waist to his neck. He had cuffs from his elbows to his wrists, but his upper arms were exposed. They were strong and defined, and even though he was handsome, her first inclination was to fear him. "Oh, yes, that's him there, my brother Nicolot," Amira said from beside her. Nicolot turned away from her, and she watched him walk into a group of women. He moved with the grace of a prince, but the caution of a fighter. KaLeah had to look away when one of the ladies reached up to touch his arm. She knew she could knock them all down in 3 seconds, she told herself with a smirk. But maybe delicate is what this prince wanted in a girl. Delicate, precious, and eager to please, all the things KaLeah was not. Just then, a boy about Amira's age approached the table. He had soft blonde hair, a sweet smile, and beautiful blue eyes. He bowed, and Amira blushed slightly. "Happy birthday, princess," he said. "I am Jaren, son of Favor Bizarre. My father is ill and could not make it, but from our entire family, we wish you much merriment and many presents." He winked and then bowed again. Amira let out a tiny giggle at this and shot a quick glance at KaLeah. "Thank you, Jaren," Amira said to the boy. "And it is nice to meet you. Send your father my well wishes." "That is very kind," Jaren replied, "as gracious as she is beautiful." KaLeah fought the urge to roll her eyes at their flirting. Amira was smiling from ear to ear, and KaLeah realized that the poor child probably didn't stand a chance. No doubt King Erasmus had already chosen her future husband. He had probably made the arrangement when she was born. Amira had probably already been sold to the highest bidder. KaLeah let her thoughts go back to Nicolot. When her eyes finally found him again, she was relieved to see that he was talking with a few men and most of the women had dispersed. His fate would be similar to his sister's, she imagined. Some poor old girl is out there right now just waiting to be forced into a marriage with the most beautiful man KaLeah had ever seen. His smile turned into a laugh as the small group of men broke out into laughter. He turned that laugh toward KaLeah and caught her eyes. For some reason, he held them there, even after the laughing faded. Why is he looking at me again, she wondered. It must be the dress, or maybe he's just looking at his sister to see she's having a good time. As her heart picked up the pace in her chest, she wasn't sure which one she preferred. Reluctantly, she forced herself to look at the food on her plate. "I must get out of here soon," she told herself.